Hello there, a warm welcome to another edition of Tech Trends, your weekly journey into the world of tech, innovation, and creativity, all through an African lens. On the program this week, tech meets tradition as digital artist and creative technologist Malik Afedbua uses AI to rewrite the narrative around African identity and aging. Plus, I'll be talking about open source AI with Gilbert Igwe, who will be breaking down what openness in AI really means, as well as untangling the ethics and risks of open source AI. We'll give you more in just a moment. Do stay with us. This is Tech Trends, and I'm Olayemi Oshidendi.
The purest case of an intelligence explosion would be an artificial intelligence rewriting its own source code. The key idea is that if you can improve intelligence even a little, the process accelerates. At a tipping point, like trying to balance a pen on one end, as soon as it tilts even a little, it quickly falls the rest of the way.
Technology is changing how we tell stories, and creatives like Malik Afedbua are using it to make sure African voices and identities are seen and celebrated. Malik is a digital artist, creative technologist, and virtual reality curator. He's also the CEO of Slick City Media, where he blends art, culture, and technology to challenge stereotypes and spark new conversations. One of his most powerful works, the Elder series, uses AI to portray African seniors dressed in stylish, bold, and colorful fashion on a virtual runway. We'll show you more.
Hi, I'm Malik, a creative technologist and a storyteller based in Lagos, Nigeria.
This is Malik Afedbua, a digital artist, filmmaker, creative technologist, and the mind behind Slick City Media, where art, culture, and tech collide to challenge stereotypes and spark new conversations. For Malik, it all started with curiosity, a deep love for tech, and a hunger to explore the future of storytelling.
I love technology, and I've always been a tech buff, a gadget freak. I love to experiment. I love to know what the next technology will be like in the next 10 years. So that's who I am. So that kind of spilled into my company as well. I love to experiment. I love to experiment on the next ways to tell stories, on the next ways to receive stories. Experimenting with VR and AR was what led me to AI, because I've done a bunch of things in that realm, telling stories, in an immersive space. Did a few things with Meta, sponsored by Rockefeller Foundation and Africa No Filter. A couple of years ago that we documented the formatted bits to kind of keep that space, that heritage space. Even if it does die out, we have that space in the virtual realm as well. But that kind of evolved into me thinking about what is next in storytelling, what is next in consuming stories, and that's how I started working with AI and artificial intelligence.
From experimenting with virtual reality and augmented reality to exploring immersive experiences, Malik's foray into tech was never about the hype. It was about access and impact. For him, AI is not a shortcut. It's a collaborator, a tool to enhance, not replace, creativity. He was always experimenting, always building new workflows to solve old problems. So when AI tools became more accessible in late 2022 and 2023, Malik was ready.
I approach AI as a tool, and it's not a replacement, it's just an enhancement. And if I approach it as a tool, that means that every other tool that I've used in the past, the same way I approach it. So it's not something I will just go and approach and try and use that to type the prompts, get the product, and put it out there. That's not what I do. I create things, from scratch mostly. I train a neural network mostly, or I use it to speed up my workflow mostly. And because I experiment with it a lot, I find new ways to approach it. I find new pipelines on how to, solve problems. December 2022, that ran through the entire 2023, even up until now, funny enough. But Experimentation was one of it, but it wasn't just about experimentation. It was about access. So as a creative, I want to shoot my films. I want to tell my stories, but what is the access? What's the entry to the bar? What's the barrier to the entry to all these things? So I think about all of these things. So when I find tools that I could manipulate to help me tell those stories, I'm always excited. And that was one of the things that made me do that. So AI was something that before it became a facade, before it became a buzzword, I've been experimenting with AI for the past 3 years. Before any of this thing became anything. And when I was doing that, it was not what we're looking at today because what it was being trained on was not as much as what's being trained on right now. So the results were not as good, very mangled, very, very abstract. But I had hope. I felt like if I could create things with this technology, that means the future is going to be different. I didn't know in the next few months it was going to blow up. Like the access to OpenAI, ChatGPT, everything started to come up. DALI 2, DALI 3. And I'm like, okay, we're getting there. So I followed through, experimented, taught myself everything I needed to teach myself. So while I was doing that, I already knew what I was doing, but it's not what it seemed. When I approached the technology, it wasn't what I was expecting at first because I forget we're in Africa sometimes. I forget we're Africans. So most of the things are not built with us in mind. So we have to find our ways, to interact and to know what role that we play in that space.
But for Malik, this journey also came with a wake up call. The algorithms weren't built with Africa in mind. Misrepresentation was everywhere. African identities were often reduced to cliches, poverty, or even non existence. So he decided to do something about it.
Misrepresentation and the bias in that space is massive. It's getting better, but it was worse. So when I first of all tried to create fashion show for the elders, I was getting images that were not representing our culture, not representing us. I was getting impoverished images, and I was thinking, why was I getting impoverished images? Is it that we don't have the right data online, or is it that it's trained on the wrong data? But when I delved into research, it was a lot deeper than that. And that was a rabbit hole for me. And when you look at the disparities or the comparison between the two cultures in a picture, you will see how minor we are and how. So that was what stock photography was trained on. If you go on stock photography today and type in stuff about Africa, you still find biased images.
One of Malik's most powerful works is the Elder series, where he uses artificial intelligence to reimagine African seniors styled in bold, elegant fashion, walking virtual runways with pride. He trained the AI himself because when you can't find representation, you build it.
So what is AI trained on? It's trained on all these things, stock photography and every other thing that you find online. And there is no regulation. It's just literally everything. So if our data that is out there, it's not being intentional, then it's going to be trained on data that's just out there. So if we're doing TV shows, films, everything, and we're not being intentional about the kinds of things we put out there, it's a problem because in the future, that is the trainings on this AI neural network and everything will be trained on everything that we put out. So what would the next generation have to feed on? So it wasn't great, but I was able to train it with my data. I've been in this industry for 15 years, and I keep data, I keep storage, hard and everything. So I trained it with everything that I had, from cultures to fashion to clothing to people, and that was what I used to bring out the first fashion show for the elders that went viral.
The Elder series didn't just go viral, it sparked a global conversation about age, identity, and how we see beauty. From fashion shows to art galleries, the project traveled across continents, challenging ageism and inviting us all to rethink what it means to be African, as well as growing old with grace and dignity. Malik also understands the importance of ownership in this space. With every project, he ensures originality, feeding the AI with his own work and protecting it through copyright.
Most of the time you can't copyright most of these things, but that's based on how much of the data that you own in it or how much of the inputs that you have in it. Over 60-70% you can definitely copyright it. So I make sure that whatever I create with AI, I don't let it scrape off data. I don't let it scrape off somebody else's artwork or someone else's job. I'm also a creative, so I can create the process and just feed it to the AI machine and make it enhanced, or make it faster, or create more variations of what I want to do. Put it into other software like Photoshop, Illustrator, and still, manipulate it to what I really want it to be and get to a final product. Then it's me. Then I could copyright it. Then, I'm not stealing anybody's work. That's how been navigating it from the past up until today. We have a role to play. You can't wait for this creative for the back end, the tech companies to do this for you. So in Africa, for instance, just in a village in Kenya, they speak 20 languages. Just picture that. So it's up to the people in Kenya, in that community, to someone that understands that, to feed it the right data for proper representation. Same thing with Nigeria, same thing with all the subcultures, Africa and everything, because most of the time it sees Africa as a country, not as a continent. And Africa has many different countries. So we as creators, we as individuals, we have to put out the right data that represents us, like in the most valid way, in the most credible way, from our cultures, from what we stand for, from who we are. So that way it's trained on that. Because everything that we see about Black history mostly is slavery, but there was something beyond slavery, before slavery. But why is it stuck on slavery?
But beyond copyright, Malik reminds us that we cannot wait for the tech companies. It's on us to upload our truth, our beauty, and our voice. And he is already thinking ahead.
Right now, I'm currently documenting stories from elderly people that are aged 80 and above, from all the cultures, like everywhere in all parts of Nigeria, all sub levels, all major levels, everything. And the fact of that is, when I'm done in Nigeria, I'm doing it for the entire countries in the world, Africa and the rest of the world. I'm not just documenting, I'm also filming them, and I'm going to be exhibiting them in a holographic way. So in 50 years' time, you could be speaking to your ancestors. Nobody in our lifetime ever spoke to their ancestors or heard from their ancestors. So that's currently what I'm doing. So, and that came up from the elder series, from the AI theater now into the physical, that now we're touching lives all around the world and preserving history, culture, values, heritage forever. So yeah.
A bigger mission lies ahead for Malik, which is ensuring that African stories, languages, and identities are represented in our shared digital future. Because in a world where AI learns from everything we put online, the absence of African narratives means generations could grow up without ever seeing themselves reflected in the future. For Malik Afedbua, technology is not just about innovation, it's about inclusion. It's about making sure that African voices are not just heard, but remembered, celebrated, and reflected in every frame of our digital world.
Did you know the first photo took 8 hours to expose? Taking a picture today is effortless. Just pull out your phone and tap a button. But photography has come a long way since its early days, when capturing a single image involved bulky cameras, metal or glass plates, and exposure times that stretched for hours. The photography, widely regarded as the first in history, is titled View from the Window at Le Gras, taken by Nisforé Niepce. A grainy image of French landscape captured on a metal plate is believed to be the world's earliest surviving photograph, dating back to 1826 or 1827. Due to the limitations of early photographic technology, the exposure for this image took an astonishing 8 hours. This long exposure time is also why people rarely smiled in old photographs. They had to remain perfectly still for extended periods, making smiling impractical.
As debates heat up over who gets to build and benefits from artificial intelligence, the question of openness has taken center stage. Conversations around access, ethics, and innovation are becoming more important. And one of the biggest questions at the heart of it all is, what does it really mean for AI to be open source? Gilbert Igwe, an AI and data scientist who is passionate about building inclusive and responsible AI systems, will be unpacking the realities of open source AI with me. Let's dive into it. Now, Gilbert, when we talk about open source AI, what exactly do we mean? Some people conflate it with open weight models, but there seems to be more nuance. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, pretty well. So when people say open source, really, they often conflate it with open weights or open code and open data. Now, open source ideally means that the model architecture The model weights, the training data, and the code are all publicly available under a license that allow reuse, inspection, and modification. But in practice, that's what we have in actuality is that many models labeled as open source are mainly open weight. So you have Meta's Llama or Mistral. What they do is they release the final weights for inference and some data in the system guide for fine tuning, but not the data or training code. Now, the folks at DeepSeek, they've gone a little far ahead and shared the weights and the published paper on the model architecture and some training techniques, but not the exact training code or data. So you have training weights and a little bit of information about the model, but you don't have the architecture if you wanted to replicate this thing exactly, in your own space with the same data to get the same result. So that is the confusion, and it stems from a lack of unified standards, right? As of 2024, that's last year, over 70% of so-called open models on Hugging Face, which is a hub where you have a lot of these weights hosted, they only meet partial openness. So open source really means that everything is open out there. You can look at the architecture, you can look at the data, you can look at the model, you can replicate it and get exactly the same result, or because of the probabilistic nature of AI, very close result. But open weight is where you can go on a hub like Hugging Face and download what has been already pre-built and you can build on it. So what we have really in most of the cases is open weights.
Thank you, Gilbert, for breaking down that for us. But why do you think there's so much confusion around that concept of open source in AI, especially when you compare it to the traditional softwares? What should people, especially those outside of the tech bubble, what should they understand about the differences?
So the thing is this, right? Traditional open source in the traditional sense, where you have software like Linux and MySQL or MySQL, it's easy to audit. You can tell exactly what has happened, the process that when the builder went through to get it to where it is. You can fork it. Forking means you can download it and take a copy of it and build on it and customize it, and you can run it. It's pretty deterministic. Every time you download it, every time you open it, everything is the same and it's modular. Now, AI, by contrast, is probabilistic, like I said earlier, and it's data driven and it's compute intensive. So it makes it opaque, even when the code is open.
Now, one big concern, about this open source in AI is access not just to models, but, to the data behind them. Now, can we truly call something open if the data is trained and remains closed? How does restricted access to training data affect the transparency and even global participation?
So now it really cannot be called open if the data is closed, because AI again is data driven, right? You have this mathematical architecture that you build, right? It takes matrices and extracts relationships and data. Now, if you do not have the underlying data, which is the foundation of AI behavior, then openness becomes performative transparency. So if really there is a consensus to make it open, let me have the data. Let me see what you trained it on. Are there biases in the data, right? Because these are really important concepts, right? The bias that the LM inherits, or the AI inherits from the data, that bias, it also produces during inference. And I do believe that eventually you may have questions about that, and I'm happy to provide further answers, because it's a critical component of the AI system itself, the bias that is inherent in the data.
Of course, I'm going to come back to that, but you're absolutely right about, having all the processes involved. So if people want to improve on them, for their projects, they get to see everything. But let's talk about values and ethics. How do open source principles in AI, tie into the broader push for responsible and ethical AI? This is a conversation that, a lot of people have been, having. Is openness automatically a step toward fairness, or are there pitfalls?
Now that's a really good question. So openness can promote fairness, but not automatically. Now, on the positive side, it allows peer review, right? I can see exactly what data you trained this on. I can see exactly the mathematical computations going on the back end. Um, these are cornerstones of responsible AI, right? However, without inclusive data sets where we all come together to, look at the data and say, okay, there is some bias in this data. For example, let's take a hypothetical model trained by Meta, right? To identify fraudulent behavior, right? And I've had some Nigerians complain about this, that was trained on data that erroneously labels any IM, that's any, what you call it, that DM, right? Any DM from an account that is domiciled in Nigeria as potential fraud. Now, in that case, there will be a lot of false positives, right? Wherein people's account get wrongly flagged or for fraud just because there's been that systemic hypothesis built into the data. It's a bias that's built into the data about the character of an average Nigerian. You see, right? So if there is no inclusive data set curation, there is no diverse governance and bias audits, and open model can still replicate systemic harm, just more publicly.
But how do we balance, the openness needed for innovation, with the very real risks of misuse? Should there be like guardrails or maybe governance structures around open source AI releases?
Yes. I do believe that openness without guardrails is reckless. So we need a nuanced system of governance, not necessarily censorship, right? A governance in the sense, okay, just imagine it as having a genius at your beck and call, right? Both for good, like to improve business processes and automate your day to day, and also for evil. So the ideal balance I would recommend, right, would be digitally signing every model with a unique identity of the user. Say you went on, for example, Hugging Face, again, like I mentioned, a hub where you have these models, the model weights, and as you download the weights, right, there should be a unique identification of who you are. And I believe this will be possible soon with Sam Altman's Wald, the CEO of OpenAI, or co-founder of OpenAI rather. He's founded this. There's this company called Wald. It's a framework for human identity. And I also believe beyond that, it can also be a new framework that's built on the blockchain, right? Where, like I said, every single weight downloaded can be traced to an individual.
The AI journey is indeed a long and complex one, and we're also finding our paths, on that journey. But one quick question I want you to discuss, and I want you to discuss this as briefly as possible. Does open sourcing an AI model automatically reduce bias, or can it actually make bias more visible?
So open source can amplify bias. Now again, it depends on the data, right? Now, if the data has inherent biases, then expect the model as was open source, right? The more people that use it, the more people are exposed to the biases, and the more the biases are expanded. So that is why it's very important that the model itself be really, really open, like rightly open, not just open weights, right? So that we can see, we as Africans, now think about it from this perspective, right? Over the years, I'll say over the centuries, of course, I wasn't born then, but history tells us that there is a narrative that negatively paints a picture of an African, right, as low IQ, and in the case of Nigeria, as an average Nigerian being a scammer or being a fraudulently oriented, right? Now, some of these biases are built into the data. So we need access to these, to the model weights, and in addition to the weights, the architecture and the data, so we can see the stories that have been negatively told about us, that have been negatively built about us into these data sets, and we can improve them. And another way we can look at it is to take the whole story into our own hands. I mean, there's so much research work that's been done that we can collate our data, curate our own data, and begin to tell our story from an African perspective. Quite frankly, it's not rocket science. The math behind this is easy. It only takes time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes some money. But I think that the narrative should be Africa or Nigeria in this context. trying to build their own, curate their own data set, basically, to tell their own story and put a data set out there.
Well, it's been an interesting and insightful conversation with you, Gilbert Ikwe, AI and data scientist. Thank you so much for joining us on Tech Trends.
Thank you.
Well, it's a wrap on the show this week. Thank you for watching. Just as always, we will continue to show you how startups, big techs, and of course, inventful thinkers are crafting homegrown solutions using technology in the country. Remember, you can always relive this and past editions of the program on the Channels TV YouTube page, and I encourage you to watch, share, and like your favorite episodes. For Tech Trends, I'm Olayemi Oshidende. I'll see you next time.